Now that Hogan Company has figured out all of the costs of the inventory that is flowed through their machining department, they can make their PCR for the assembly department. And this PCR for the assembly department is going to determine what portion of all costs that flowed through this department during the month of December need to be transferred out, in this case into the last phase of production, to finished goods inventory, and what portion of all the costs that came through this department during the period are going to end up contained in the assembly department's ending WIP. The PCR looks exactly the same as the one that we did for machining. I'll back up for a second here. With one exception, we have a new column, and then we have a new column called transferred in. Machining was the first phase of production, therefore they couldn't have any cost transfer in. This is where these gonculators originated from. It's the first step in the production process. However, the assembly department is not the first step, it's the second step, and in our case the last step, because we're only a two-step process. For every department, every phase of production after the first one, you're always going to have a transferred in cost, and it's going to keep track of all of the costs that come in which were spent in previous departments. It sums up. So if we had a 3 or 4 or 5 step production process, as we made a PCR for that department, that phase of production, the transferred in cost wouldn't be just the cost of the phase immediately before it. It would be all of the costs incurred through all phases of production before it got there. That being said, if you can do this thing for 2 departments, you can do it for 15 departments. So there's no real point in having you have a ridiculously huge set of PCRs to flow costs through. We're only going to have 2. So for the assembly department, our transferred in is just the costs of the machining department. We're going to start, like we did before, figuring out our physical units. Our information tells us that the assembly department had beginning WIP of 400 units when the period began. So I'm going to come and bring that number over here. How many units were started in December? How many units were transferred in? That's 2,000, which is given in the information, but it's also equal to the physical units which were completed and transferred out from the prior department. What comes out of one department goes into the next department in the production chain. So we're going to bring that 200 over, which means we need to account for the 2,400 gonculators which came into the assembly department during the period. Some of them got finished, some of them didn't. We have that information too. We completed and transferred out 1,900 gonculators, and the other 500 gonculators are still in our ending WIP. And that is where our 2,400 different gonculators ended up. We accounted for all of the units we had to account for. To do our costs calculations, we need to figure out how many equivalent units of production we have. And again, equivalent units of production means how complete it is for that particular cost component. For completed and transferred out, it has to be the same as the number of physical units. We would not have transferred assembled gonculators off to finished goods inventory if they weren't done for everything that was transferred in. They weren't properly machined. If they weren't done for direct materials, all the materials necessary to assemble these parts that were sent to us from machining into finished gonculators, and in the process of doing so, conversion costs, paying all of the labor costs and all the overhead costs necessary to turn those parts into finished gonculators. So your completed and transferred out equivalent units is always going to be the same all the way across the board. It is going to be 1,900 for all of these because they're all complete for those 3 different cost components because they were transferred out. Our ending WIP probably isn't complete for all of those cost components, but it's going to be complete for one thing, and that is the transferred in costs. The machining department would have not sent us parts to be assembled had they not been completely machined. If they'd not, incurred all of the materials costs to make the parts and all the labor costs to take those raw materials and turn them into parts which could be later assembled. Your equivalent units in ending WIP for transferred in cost has to be the same as your physical units for ending WIP. They would not be in the assembly department if they weren't all the way done for everything in the machining department, where the costs were transferred in from, had to do. So that is also 2,400. For the direct materials and conversion costs unique to this assembly department, however, it doesn't have to be the same. We are going to figure out how complete these 500 units in ending WIP are for direct materials, how complete they are for conversion costs. And we're going to figure out, for that same amount of money and time, how many gonculators we could have fully assembled. Our information tells us that the gonculators, which are an ending whip, are 20% complete for direct material costs. Well, to finish 500 units, 20% of the way, costs Hogan Company about the same in direct materials as it would to do 100 gonculators the entire way, to complete them from start to finish. So for your equivalent units for direct materials and conversion costs, you simply multiply the physical units that you have in ending whip by how complete they are for that particular cost component. And by that rationale, the 500 units we have, which are 40% finished, cost us about the same amount of time and money as it would have to do 200 gonculators from beginning to end. So our equivalent units of production is how many units we could have finished all the way through for the cost that it took us to finish some units all the way through and partially complete others. For the same amount of cost that we incurred for direct materials within the assembly department, we could have fully assembled 2,000 gonculators. For the cost that we paid for conversion costs in the assembly department, we could have completed 2,100 gonculators. That is our total units accounted for. That is our equivalent units of production. And now for our costs. We're going to start with our beginning whip. Our information tells us that the units which the assembly department had in process when the period started, those 400 gonculators they were in the process of assembling on December 1st, they already had $18,000 worth of costs committed to them, which was transferred in from prior phases of production, in our case, the machining department. Those 400 units that were in beginning whip did not have any direct material costs added to them. It's a big fat zero. And they had $2,000 of conversion costs, which is unique to this assembly department, already committed to them. Those 400 gonculators that we had in beginning whip were being carried at a cost in total of $20,000. What did we add during the period? Well, direct materials and conversion costs is easy. We have that information. The information tells us that during December of 20XX, we added $30,000 of material costs, and then we added $40,000 worth of conversion costs. But how much did we add for transferred in? Well, what was transferred in to this department, those additional costs that came along with those units which were transferred in, has to be equal to what was transferred out by the prior department. So for your costs added during the period in your transferred in column, just go back to the last PCR you had, like the immediately preceding phase of production. In our case is machining, and it says that the amount of costs which were complete for units which were completed and transferred out was $90,000. So when those parts to build gonculators were transferred to assembly, the $90,000 of costs were transferred with them. Therefore, they were added, in this case, to this particular PCR. Let me fix that templating so it looks better. There we go. So what total costs do we have to account for? Well, we know that all gonculators which were being assembled during the period had $108,000 worth of costs that came from the machining department being carried in that inventory. For direct materials, the beginning whip had none, but our department, the assembly department, added $30,000 of costs for December, which means we have to account for those $30,000 of direct material costs. And the sum of the two numbers above means we also have to account for $42,000 worth of conversion costs. Well, how much cost in total did Hogan Company's assembly department add during the period? The $90,000 which was transferred in, plus $30,000 for their unique direct materials, plus $40,000 for their unique conversion costs. That is a total of $160,000. What amount of total cost do we have to account for? Again, you can find it two ways. Either take the total cost of your beginning whip and add to it your total cost added during the period. We come up with $180,000 in that case. Or we can figure out the total cost we have to account for as the total transferred in costs plus the direct material cost from this department plus the conversion costs from this department. And that adds up to $180,000. You'll get the same number both ways. Now, to figure out what portion of these costs that we have to account for ended up being transferred out to finished goods and what portion ended up in ending WIP, we need to figure out our cost per equivalent unit. So we're going to divide by our total EUP. And that is, again, the total units accounted for in the physical unit section. It was 2,400 for transferred in, 2,000 for direct materials, and 2,100 for conversion costs. So I'm just going to go and use the fill handle to bring all of these numbers down. There we go. And now to find my cost per equivalent unit, I just take the cost that we have to account for, the total cost that came from that cost category, and divide it by our equivalent units of production. We had $108,000 worth of costs from the machining department, which was transferred to us and carried in all gonculators which were assembled during the month of December. Well, we assembled 2,400 gonculators for our equivalent units of production for transferred in, which means each gonculator that came through our lines that was completed had $45 in cost carried in its value, which were transferred in from the machining department. For direct materials, we added $30,000 worth of direct material costs, which we said was enough to fully complete 2,000 units. Therefore, each gonculator that we assemble in the assembly department requires us to spend $15 in direct material costs, bolts, screws, nuts, whatever goes into gonculators that are unique to this assembly department. And then we had $42,000 worth of conversion costs, which we know from our equivalent units of production is enough to fully assemble 2,100 gonculators. So if it costs $42,000 to assemble 2,100 gonculators, it costs $20 per gonculator in conversion costs for the things that we do which are unique to the assembly department. And with that information, we can figure out what portion of this $180,000 worth of cost is going to get transferred out and what portion of it is going to stay here. And to do so, we're going to go and we are going to take our equivalent units of production for completed and transferred out, which is going to be 19,000 all the way across, and we're going to multiply it by the cost per equivalent units for that category. If we had 1,900 gonculators transferred out, and each one of those that was transferred to finished goods was carrying $45 worth of cost, which was transferred in already from the machining department, that means that we are going to transfer out of this department $85,500, which was previously transferred in to us. We transferred out 1,900 gonculators one more time. And for those 1,900 gonculators, the assembly department spent $15 in material to assemble them. So those 1,900 gonculators cost Hogan Company $28,500 in direct materials to assemble. And those 1,900 gonculators that were transferred out each cost $20 in conversion costs to assemble, to put together. So if we spent $20 per unit to assemble 1,900 units, we spent $38,000 in total. And since we finished those 1,900 units and we transferred them to finished goods, the cost of doing so in terms of labor and overhead has to be transferred with them. So in total, the total amount of that $180,000, which should be completed and transferred out to finished goods, is equal to the sum of these three numbers, and that is $152,000. What about the units that we have in ending WIP? We have 500 units in ending WIP. Again, they wouldn't be in the assembly department if they weren't complete for all the stuff that machining had to do, if they didn't have all of the transferred in costs already in them. So for those 500 units, we can simply multiply it by the $45 cost per equivalent unit, which was transferred in to us. Those 500 gonculators that are being assembled when the period ends have $22,500 worth of costs contained in that inventory, which were transferred in to us. Those 500 units we have that are in ending WIP, however, aren't done for direct materials or conversion costs. Well, we can figure out how many units we could have completed for that same amount of cost. And that allows us to take our equivalent units of production in ending WIP and multiply it by our cost per equivalent unit to figure out what amount of cost is being carried in that inventory. We have 100 equivalent units in our ending WIP for direct materials. So at a cost per equivalent unit of $15, that means we have $1,500 of direct material costs from the assembly department, which is being contained in gonculators we have not finished, that's still a work in process when December ends. We have 200 units in ending WIP, equivalent units, multiply that by the $20 cost per equivalent unit. That is $4,000 worth of conversion costs unique to the assembly department, which we've already spent on gonculators, which are still a work in process when December ended. We add those three together, to get our total ending WIP, and it comes out to be $28,000. So what is our total cost, which we've accounted for? Well, we know for our transferred in cost, $85,500 of it is getting transferred out finished goods inventory. And the other $22,500 is going to stay in the assembly departments being inventoried to our ending WIP. And that's a total of $108,000. So we accounted for all $108,000 that we needed to account for. For direct materials, we're transferring out $28,500 worth of direct material costs, and the other $1,500 is going to be staying in this department and its ending WIP. Add those two together, we get $30,000, which is the amount that we had to account for, so we check out there. For conversion costs, $38,000 worth of conversion costs that were spent by the assembly department during the month of December are going to be transferred out to finished goods inventory for the gonculators that we finished assembling, while the other $4,000 is going to be inventoried to the gonculators that are still in work in process when the period ended. That adds up to $42,000, the total amount that we had to account for. And we already know from above that $108,000 plus $30,000 plus $42,000 is $180,000. So we know this has to be $180,000, but it's also equal to the $152,000 that we transferred out, plus the $28,000 that is in ending WIP. And that is where our $180,000 worth of costs that we are tracking ended up.